The United States Federal Reserve Bank, or central bank, was created in 1913. And what happened was the authorities were responding to the unreliability and instability of a currency system in the US, which was based on different banks issuing different notes in different currencies. Now, at the time, the US economy had overtaken Britain as the world's largest. And in terms of commerce and a lot of international trade, despite the US having exceeded the British economy, you found that a lot of international transactions were still being done in British pounds and also in gold. Also at that time, most of the developed countries pegged their currencies to gold to create stability in the exchange rates. And this was known as the gold standard. However, when World War I broke out in 1914, many countries abandoned the gold standard to be able to pay their military expenses with paper money, what we call fiat currency. So they printed more paper money without supporting gold deposits, and they effectively devalued their currencies through inflation. 3 years into World War I, Britain, which had steadfastly held onto the gold standard to maintain its position as the world's leading currency, found itself having to borrow money for the first time. Now, due to constraints in the availability of capital in domestic capital markets, Britain increasingly tried to borrow money via capital markets in the United States. In 1919, Britain was finally forced to abandon the gold standard, and that decimated the bank accounts of international merchants who traded in pounds. They'd been reliant on the gold standard. By then, the dollar had replaced the pound as the world's leading reserve currency. Now, as it did in World War I, the Americans entered World War II well after the fighting began. And before they entered the war, the US served as the Allies' main provider of weapons and supplies and other goods. It collected much of its payment in gold. And by the end of the Second World War, the US owned the vast majority of the world's gold. In 1944, delegates from 44 Allied countries met in Bretton Woods in New Hampshire, and they came up with a system to manage foreign exchange that would not put any country at a disadvantage. It was decided that the world's currencies couldn't be linked to gold, but they could be linked to the US dollar, which was effectively linked to gold. This arrangement came to be known as the Bretton Woods Agreement. It established that central banks would maintain fixed exchange rates between their currencies and the US dollar. In turn, the United States would redeem US dollars for gold on demand. Now, countries had some degree of influence over their currencies in situations where they became overvalued or too weak relative to the US dollar. They could buy or sell their currency to regulate the money supply. Now, as a result of the Bretton Woods Agreement, the US dollar was officially crowned the world's reserve currency, and it was backed by the world's largest gold reserves. Instead of gold reserves, other countries accumulated reserves of US dollars. Now, needing a place to store their dollars, countries began buying US Treasury securities, which they considered to be a safe store of money. And the demand for Treasury securities, coupled with the deficit spending needed to finance the Vietnam War and the Great Society domestic programs that the US engaged in the 1960s and 70s, ended up flooding the market with paper money. Now, with growing concerns over the stability of the US dollar, countries actually started taking their treasuries and their US dollars and converting them back into gold. The demand for gold was such that President Nixon was forced to intervene and to de-link the dollar from gold, which meant that these countries couldn't now change their US dollars into gold. And that effectively introduced what we know today as floating exchange rates. So through periods of stagflation, high inflation, and deflation, the US dollar has remained the world's reserve currency, based largely on the size and the strength of the US economy, the dominance of US financial markets, and the general influence of the US on the international economy as a whole. So despite large deficit spending, despite trillions of dollars in foreign debt and the unbridled printing of US dollars, US Treasury securities remain the safest store of money because of the trust and the confidence that the world has in the ability of the United States to pay its debts. Because of that, the dollar is still the most redeemable currency for facilitating world commerce and is the world's reserve currency.